At first, everything seemed completely normal. I'd known my neighbor for about a year by then, and our interactions had always been friendly. He wasn't one of those overly familiar types, but he was always willing to lend a hand when I needed it. A little help with moving heavy furniture, picking up packages from the mailroom, or even just chatting over the fence when our paths crossed in the hallway. It was the kind of casual, neighborly connection that felt natural. He was approachable, easy to talk to, and genuinely seemed to have my best interests in mind. I remember thinking how lucky I was to have someone like him living right next door. There was nothing to suggest that anything was amiss in our dynamic. Sure, he was a little older than me, maybe by 5 or 6 years, but that wasn't something I gave much thought to. He was single like me, and it never crossed my mind that he might have any other intentions beyond being a good neighbor. In fact, I'd never even thought about him that way. He was just someone who was easy to talk to, someone who would offer advice when I needed it. He was the kind of person who always seemed to have an answer for everything, whether it was about fixing things around the house or offering advice on life. It was comforting to know I had someone I could turn to in case something went wrong, or if I just needed company. But even though everything seemed fine on the surface, there were small moments that felt off, though I couldn't quite place my finger on why. Looking back, maybe I should have paid more attention to them. Sometimes when we'd chat for a bit, he'd look at me in a way that made me feel uncomfortable, like his eyes lingered a little too long, or his smile seemed a little too intense. I would brush it off, telling myself that it was just my imagination running wild. He was just being friendly, right? Everyone has their quirks. I remember one time, shortly after a brief chat by the mailbox, I caught myself wondering if he was actually flirting with me. The thought felt weird, even though I knew he was a good guy. I didn't want to overthink it. Maybe I was just reading too much into his behavior. After all, he had been nothing but kind to me, and I never wanted to believe that someone I trusted could be anything other than genuine. But there was always that small voice at the back of my mind that I couldn't shake. It was just a feeling, nothing solid to go on, but even though it lingered, I kept ignoring it, hoping that it would fade. I also remember how, whenever I needed help, he would always volunteer without hesitation. If I had a flat tire or needed help with something minor, like fixing a light bulb, he'd always be the first one to offer. It was nice, of course. He was polite and seemed like a good guy who just wanted to help out his neighbor. But over time, the help began to feel like more than just friendly assistance. He started dropping by more often than usual, and I didn't think much of it at the time. I mean, who wouldn't appreciate someone who's always available when you need them, right? But the more he came around, the more I noticed that there was an intensity to his presence that wasn't there before. It wasn't just the little things like his lingering glances, but the way he would stand a little too close when we talked. Sometimes he would touch my arm lightly or give me a pat on the back that felt more intimate than it should have been, and yet, I kept brushing it off. I thought maybe I was just being overly sensitive. Maybe it was my own discomfort with closeness that made me feel like he was crossing some invisible line. After all, he wasn't doing anything wrong, right? The thing is, I had always been careful with boundaries. I'd made sure to keep things professional and platonic with everyone I knew, including him. But the more time I spent around him, the more I felt like something was shifting, something that I couldn't ignore forever. I remember once when we were sitting in his living room, chatting about the most random things, I felt the tension in the air. I couldn't pinpoint exactly what had changed, but the conversation had taken on a strange energy. There were moments when he would look at me as if he were seeing me in a completely different light. I laughed it off, even though inside I felt a creeping sense of discomfort. I never imagined that a simple neighborly relationship could spiral into something so complicated. I didn't think it was possible for someone who had been so kind to me to turn into someone I would eventually come to fear. But at that point, I couldn't have known just how wrong I was about him. At that point, I never could have imagined what was about to happen. It all started out so innocently. One evening, after a casual chat in the hallway, my neighbor asked if I'd like to come over to his place for a drink. Nothing fancy, he said, just a quiet evening to relax, maybe watch a movie. At first, I hesitated. I hadn't really thought about spending time with him outside of the usual neighborly exchanges. But then, I reasoned that it would be harmless. After all, we'd spoken plenty of times in passing, and he had always been respectful. Plus, he seemed like a decent guy who wouldn't cross any boundaries. So I agreed. What was the harm in a casual hangout? When I arrived at his apartment, it felt just like any other visit. His place was neat, the kind of home you'd expect from someone who clearly took care of his things. He offered me a drink, and we settled on the couch talking about the usual things: work, life, random topics that had no real depth but filled the space. I didn't think much of it. It felt like two people just unwinding after a long day. But after a couple of drinks, I started to feel a little lightheaded. I wasn't used to drinking much, and I probably hadn't eaten enough that day. I shrugged it off as just a normal reaction to alcohol. But then I noticed something strange. My neighbor, who had been so easygoing earlier, was now paying more attention to me. His glances seemed a bit longer, more intense. The way he leaned in when we talked felt different. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that it was all in my head. Maybe I was just imagining things because I was feeling a little off. After all, people often get a little more animated after a few drinks, right? But the tension in the air was undeniable. He kept shifting closer, and I began to feel an unease I couldn't ignore. It was like the atmosphere in the room had changed. It wasn't the warm, friendly vibe we'd had earlier, it was something else. I could feel my pulse quicken, my body reacting in ways that were hard to explain. Every time he laughed or moved, I found myself suddenly more aware of his presence, more conscious of the fact that I wasn't quite as comfortable as I had been before. There was a strange heaviness in the air, a feeling that something was about to happen. I wasn't sure what exactly, but it felt like the line between friendship and something else was blurring. I excused myself to go to the bathroom, hoping that stepping away from the situation would clear my head. But when I stood up, my legs felt wobbly, like the alcohol was hitting me harder than I realized. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I needed to get a grip, I told myself. It was just a drink, a simple hangout. There was no reason to overthink it. But when I made my way to the bathroom, I heard him follow me. It was a small thing, just a few footsteps behind me, but it set off a warning bell in my head. I quickly brushed it off as nothing, though. I wasn't going to jump to conclusions. But when I reached the bathroom, something shifted. The door clicked behind me as he stepped into the small space, and suddenly the room felt smaller, more suffocating. I remember feeling a surge of panic. My mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. Should I say something? Should I push him away? But my body froze. It was like the alcohol had muddled my brain, and I couldn't think clearly. I didn't know what was happening, but I had this gnawing feeling that something was terribly wrong. He wasn't saying anything, but I could feel his presence behind me, closer than I ever expected. I felt like I couldn't move, like my feet were stuck to the floor. Every nerve in my body was on edge, and my heart began to pound louder and faster in my chest. But the worst part? I didn't speak up. I didn't shout or even ask him to leave. I didn't do anything. The words were there in my mind, but they never left my mouth. Instead, I stood there in stunned silence, my mind spinning, trying to process what was happening. The next thing I knew, he was closer, and I felt his hands on my arm, guiding me toward the shower. I should have fought back. I should have screamed. I should have done something. But in that moment, everything seemed to move in slow motion. It felt like I was trapped in my own body, unable to act. Every instinct told me to get away, but the words just wouldn't come. I don't know how long it lasted, maybe seconds, maybe minutes, but all I knew was that I was no longer in control. In that moment, everything that had felt so innocent just hours before, everything I had trusted about our relationship, was shattered. I couldn't believe it was happening. I couldn't believe he was the one doing this to me. I had trusted him. I had let my guard down around him. And now, here I was utterly powerless, standing there in a situation I never thought I'd find myself in. And even worse, I didn't know how to stop it. The moment I was pushed into the shower, I could feel the air leave my body. It was like everything around me froze, but my heart was still beating louder, faster, almost as if it were trying to escape my chest. I had no idea how I had gotten there, how the situation had escalated so quickly. One second, I was just trying to get my bearings, trying to recover from the disorienting feeling the alcohol had given me, and the next I was trapped, with no way out. My mind raced, desperately trying to make sense of what was happening. But my body? It was frozen in place, as though it had been paralyzed by fear and confusion. I could feel his hands on my arms, guiding me toward the shower with a firmness that left no room for hesitation. My heart pounded even harder, the sound ringing in my ears, drowning out any rational thought. I wanted to fight back. I wanted to push him away, scream, anything to stop what was happening, but my body wouldn't respond. The words were there, screaming in my mind, but they couldn't break free. Every part of me screamed no, but my lips stayed sealed. As he closed the bathroom door behind us, I felt the cold air hit my skin, a stark contrast to the warmth of the room. But the chill in the air didn't even compare to the coldness I felt deep inside, an icy fear that gripped my chest and wouldn't let go. I wanted to move. I wanted to run. But something inside me, something that I can't explain, kept me rooted in place. Maybe it was shock, or maybe it was the alcohol that made everything feel like a dream I couldn't wake up from. I could barely think straight, let alone find the strength to do anything. He didn't say a word. There was no apology, no explanation, nothing. Just the sound of his breathing and the soft, unsettling movement of his hands as they touched me. I could barely process the actions that followed. Everything felt like it was happening to someone else. His touch felt wrong, so wrong, and yet I couldn't do anything to stop it. I wanted to scream. I wanted to push him away, but the shock and fear held me in place, a terrifying paralysis that kept me silent. I tried to gather myself, tried to find the strength to push him off, but the moment I even thought about moving, he was closer. His hands were on me, pulling me closer to him. The panic started to rise again, choking me, suffocating me with its intensity. I kept telling myself that I needed to stop this, that I needed to do something, but nothing felt real. It felt like I was floating above myself, watching everything happen in a slow, agonizing motion. I couldn't believe it was happening to me. I didn't want to believe it. The water from the shower started to turn on, filling the air with a faint hiss, but it did nothing to mask the feeling of terror growing inside me. My mind was spinning, thoughts crashing together like waves. How had I let myself get into this situation? How had I let this man, this person I thought I could trust, violate my space, my body, my mind? The questions spun in my head like a whirlpool, each one feeding into the next, all of them too much to process, too much to bear. I wanted to shout, to push him away, but nothing came out. I could barely even move. It was as if my body was betraying me, too scared to react, too scared to protect itself. He kept pushing, his presence suffocating, invading every space I thought I had control over. I felt smaller with every touch, every move he made. The room felt like it was closing in around me, the walls pressing in as if I were trapped in some nightmare with no escape. Somewhere in my mind, I knew I should be doing something. I knew that I should have fought back, but all I could think about was how to get out of there. The panic inside me was overwhelming, but there was no way out. The fear in my chest was suffocating, and every attempt to calm myself only made it worse. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I just wanted to wake up from this nightmare, to find myself somewhere safe, anywhere that wasn't there with him. I don't remember how long it lasted, but when it was over, I felt a complete emptiness wash over me. It wasn't just the physical pain, it was the emotional devastation that hit the hardest. How could someone I thought I could trust do this to me? How could he take everything that had felt normal and turn it into something so terrifying, so wrong? The betrayal was too much to process, and I was left there, standing in shock, unable to move, unable to speak. My mind couldn't catch up to what had just happened, and I couldn't wrap my head around the fact that this person, this neighbor I had let into my life, had just crossed every line. When I finally gathered enough sense to move, I backed away, feeling numb and disconnected. The shock lingered, dulling every thought, every emotion. I felt like I wasn't even in my own body anymore. What had just happened? How had this become my reality? The questions hit me like a ton of bricks, but I couldn't find the answers. All I knew was that my trust had been shattered in the worst way possible, and there was no going back to the way things were before. After everything that happened, I didn't know how to move forward. My body felt like it wasn't even mine anymore. I had never felt so exposed, so violated, and yet, all I could do was retreat inside myself. I wanted to scream, to run, to tell someone everything. But I couldn't. I didn't know where to begin. The shame that gripped me was overwhelming. How had I let this happen? Why hadn't I done something sooner? All these questions circled in my mind, and the answers never seemed to come. I stayed away from him for days. I couldn't bring myself to face him. Every time I walked past his apartment, my heart would race, and I could feel the bile rising in my throat. It wasn't just fear, it was a deep, raw feeling of betrayal. He was someone I had trusted. He had been my neighbor, my confidant, someone I thought I could rely on. How could he have turned into this person? How could I have been so blind? The silence between us grew unbearable. Every time I saw him in passing, I couldn't even look at him. I felt like a ghost in my own life. The days blurred together, each one feeling like an eternity. I tried to carry on as usual, but everything felt different. I couldn't focus on anything. It was like a fog had settled over my mind, and nothing seemed to make sense anymore. The emptiness I felt was suffocating. Every moment spent in his presence, even if he wasn't directly near me, was a reminder of the violation I had suffered. It was as if my entire sense of self was wrapped in this thick, impenetrable layer of dread. I started isolating myself more. I didn't want to talk to anyone, didn't want anyone to ask me what was wrong. The weight of what had happened was something I couldn't share, not yet anyway. I kept everything inside, convincing myself that I just needed time to process. But the more I tried to push it away, the more it clung to me. His face, his touch, it was always there, like a shadow I couldn't escape. And then the guilt started. It didn't make any sense, but it was there. I began to question every decision I had made leading up to that night. Did I drink too much? Did I encourage him in some way? Why hadn't I said something sooner? The self-blame gnawed at me constantly. It felt like I was at fault in some way, like I had somehow invited this to happen. It took everything I had to remind myself that none of this was my fault. But every time I closed my eyes, the doubt crept back in. I couldn't even bring myself to go near his apartment. I avoided the hallway altogether, taking the long way around to get to my door. Even hearing his voice from across the hall made my skin crawl. It wasn't just the fear that kept me away, it was the shame that wrapped itself tightly around my chest, squeezing the air out of me. I hated feeling like this. I hated how he had turned my sense of safety into something foreign. The apartment complex, which had once felt like home, now felt like a prison. Every corner felt like a reminder of the betrayal. I began to distance myself from everything and everyone. Friends tried to reach out, but I pushed them away. I didn't want to talk. I didn't want to explain what had happened. I didn't even know where to start. It felt like I was too broken to even speak about it. No one would understand. How could they? I didn't even understand what had happened myself. The more I thought about it, the more confused I became. Was it just a terrible mistake on his part? Or had he planned it? The uncertainty ate at me, gnawing away at any semblance of peace I had left. What really bothered me, though, was the question I could never shake: why didn't I stop it? Why hadn't I screamed? Why hadn't I fought back harder? In that moment, I had felt so powerless, so frozen in place. And the thought of that made me hate myself even more. Why hadn't I been stronger? Why hadn't I protected myself? The emotional weight of it all slowly crushed me. It felt like I was carrying the burden of this secret, this brokenness, all on my own. And yet, every time I thought about sharing it with someone, every time I thought about telling a friend, or even the police, the fear stopped me cold. What if no one believed me? What if he denied it? What if I couldn't prove what had happened? The fear of not being believed, of being judged or blamed, held me back, keeping me trapped in this silence. I wanted so badly to let it all out, to break free of the suffocating weight of shame and fear. But I couldn't. Not yet. I wasn't ready to face what had happened. The emotional aftermath wasn't something you could just tell someone and expect them to understand right away. It was a slow process, one I wasn't sure I was ready for. All I knew was that, in that moment, I needed time. Time to figure out what I was supposed to do next, time to heal. But the silence between me and him, it wasn't something I could ignore forever. I would have to face it eventually. It took a long time for me to come to terms with what had happened. Every day felt like an uphill battle, but the weight of what I was carrying wasn't something I could ignore. I couldn't go on pretending everything was fine, couldn't keep hiding in the shadows. The more I tried to push the feelings away, the more they clawed at me, demanding to be acknowledged. I needed to face it. But how? I spent hours replaying the night in my head, trying to make sense of everything. My emotions were all over the place: confusion, anger, betrayal, and so much guilt. The hardest part was understanding why I hadn't spoken up sooner, why I had allowed myself to remain silent when every part of me screamed for help. It was as if I had been paralyzed by the shock, my mind unable to make sense of what was happening in real time. But looking back, the shame I felt for not reacting the way I thought I should have was crushing. I kept blaming myself, wondering if I could have done something different. Could I have stopped it? Could I have stopped it? Could I have fought harder? But as much as I blamed myself, I knew deep down that none of it was my fault. The guilt I felt was a result of everything he made me feel: powerless, vulnerable, trapped. I had trusted him, and he had used that trust against me. I was not responsible for his actions, no matter how much my mind tried to twist the truth. The hardest part was deciding what to do next. I couldn't just keep pretending it hadn't happened, but confronting him felt impossible. What would I even say? Could I really face him after everything? The thought of him coming anywhere near me made my stomach turn. And yet I knew I couldn't live like this forever, avoiding him, letting him control my life without even realizing it. Something had to change. I finally made the decision to leave my apartment for a while, to give myself some distance from everything. I needed to clear my head, to find some kind of peace. A friend offered to let me stay with her for a while, and I took her up on it, even though I hated the thought of having to explain everything. I wasn't ready to talk about it, but I knew I had to take a step away from the constant reminder of what had happened. Being in my own space felt suffocating, like I was constantly trapped in the memory of it all. I needed to breathe. In the days that followed, I did a lot of thinking. A lot of crying, too. I had so many emotions swirling inside of me, all of them conflicting. Anger at him, anger at myself, frustration at how everything had spiraled out of control. But in the quiet of my friend's home, I started to feel a small flicker of something else: strength. I realized that I couldn't keep letting him win, couldn't keep letting him haunt me. I was stronger than I gave myself credit for. I started to reach out to people again. Slowly. Tentatively. It was hard, but I knew I couldn't keep isolating myself. I wasn't ready to tell them everything yet, but I began to confide in one or two close friends. They listened without judgment, and their support helped me start to heal. It wasn't easy. I still had so many days where I felt overwhelmed by the pain, where the anger and sadness felt like too much to bear. But bit by bit, I started to find my footing again. Eventually, I knew I had to face him. I couldn't let him keep controlling my life from the shadows, but confronting him wasn't easy. The thought of standing in front of him, of looking him in the eye after what he had done, filled me with dread. But I knew it was the only way to reclaim my power, to take back control over what had happened to me. When I finally saw him again, my heart was racing, my hands shaking. I wanted to scream, to tell him exactly what he had done to me, to make him understand how deeply he had hurt me. But I also knew that the confrontation wasn't about him anymore. It was about me. It was about standing up for myself, about reclaiming my voice. I didn't get the closure I thought I would. He didn't apologize. He didn't seem to understand the weight of what he had done. But I didn't need him to. What mattered was that I had faced him. What mattered was that I had spoken up, even if it was just for me. And that was the turning point. It wasn't the end of the healing process, I still had so much to work through, still had days where the memory of what happened hit me like a wave. But by standing up for myself, by finally breaking the silence, I felt a small piece of my old self coming back. The shame slowly started to lift, the guilt began to fade, and I realized that I was allowed to take back my power, to be more than just a victim of what he had done. I wasn't broken. I was still whole. And I would heal. Slowly but surely I would heal.